Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Jonathan Haskel, who is a professor of economics at Imperial College in London, Imperial College Business School, I should say, and also the author of a couple of books. The book from a couple of years ago that you co-authored, it's called Capitalism Without Capital: The Rise of the Intangible Economy, and its sequel, which just came out, is called Restarting the Future: How to Fix the Intangible Economy. Welcome, Jonathan.
Greg, thanks so much for having me along.
Now, look, the new book has embedded in the title, How to Fix the Intangible Economy. In the first book, it says the rise of the intangible economy, but that book itself already highlights some of the challenges and problems of the intangible economy for which we are ill prepared, right? And I think, the narrative here, part of it is that there is a mismatch between the institutions that we have and this new economy, right? The institutions were designed for a tangible economy, but it's not just the institutions. I think it's also the intellectual frameworks that we have, right? The way in which we economists and lawyers, institution builders, financial theorists, right? The way in which we have been trying to understand the world. These were developed during the tangible economy. And what we've done is we've sort of just mapped over, all of those frameworks. Certainly myself as a lawyer, when I think about intellectual property, right, I'm thinking metaphorically about physical property. And certainly in economics, right, if we have something like a, Cobb-Douglas production function, right, we have this notion of capital as this stuff, right? And so I guess part of the initial question I would have for you is, why isn't that enough, right? Why can't those frameworks be elastic enough to just stretch into the intangible world? What is it that's fundamentally different about intangibles that makes it difficult for us theorists to make sense of the world?
Thanks a lot, Greg, and thanks. That's a very nice introduction. I think actually the structures you describe can be just about elastic enough, but they're ill-served for the types of new capital that we have flying around in the new economy. And the other, before diving into that, the other sort of discipline, Greg, if I may, that I would add is the measurement discipline as well.
Counting.
I'm here at Imperial College, which, as you know, is a sort of science and technology college. It's a sort of an MIT. I don't claim we're as good as MIT, but we don't have any. We have some social science departments. We don't have any, other arts departments. So it's science only. And measurement, of course, is an enormous part of the science community. So I would add that as a discipline. So look, where we're coming from, as readers of the book might know, is that our view is the economy has fundamentally changed from a tangible economy to a more intangible economy. What did the old economy used to make? It used to make very tangible things, cars and planes and trucks and aircraft and, all that kind of thing. What does the new economy make? It's people writing software. It's people writing movie scripts. It's people trying to think of new ways to market their product or publicize their brand or rearrange their organization. Those are all very intangible things. And so at the heart of your question, and at the heart of the question the books we're trying to that we were trying to write was, how do we document that economy? How do we measure it? What are the economic consequences of it? What are the institutional changes we might need? And so indeed, Greg, as you said in your question, when we think about this transition to this new style of economy, what are the challenges to economics, to accounting, to law, to political science? What are those various challenges, and are our disciplines fit for purpose?
Well, maybe we'll start with measurement, because if you're going to make a claim like there's been a fundamental shift, you have to be able to point to some data. Right. And so in some sense, you need to come up with some way of measuring these intangibles. And this has been a challenge going back. I think Fritz Machlup was one of the people that first started to think about this. And of course, Diane Coyle, who I've hosted on the podcast. Our accountant friends, right? They seem to be probably the ones having the biggest difficulty
Yeah.
trying to catch up. So this is not just true for corporate accounts, but also for national accounts. So macroeconomics is a discipline which relies primarily on, measuring things. So, maybe we can dig into that. How do we even know, right, objectively, that there's been this shift if we can't really measure it?
So again, if I may, Greg, can I try an example so that people understand what the measurement types of difficulties are? Um, Forgive me if you were a student in my class, so the students in my class listening to this will have heard all of this, so forgive me. I often start by asking them, what is Britain's most famous innovation? And people think about this, and some of them think cricket, which is a very good suggestion. Others of them think
Football?
Concorde, or sorry,
Football?
football, soccer, you mean?
Yeah.
Concord, radar, and we go through this whole list, and eventually I tell them the right answer, which is that Britain's most famous innovation is, of course, Harry Potter. And if you ask the question, what is Harry Potter from a measurement point of view? So this is getting to your question. How would I, if I was sitting as a national accountant trying to account GDP, how would I account for Harry Potter? What's tricky about Harry Potter is that it's not a conventional tangible investment. It's not as if somebody is building a new factory or making a new machine or something like that. What Harry Potter is it's an idea. So the embodiment of the idea would be the books. But then what has surrounded Harry Potter? It is things like the software that is now written to do all the special effects and all the fantastic movies. It's things like the theatrical design, which is now done in order to bring it to the stage. Things like the marketing that has to be done to have the reputation and all that sort of stuff. And none of those things do we count very well in the national accounts. So let me scroll back for a second. We certainly don't do a very good job in management accounts. So the formal accountants are very reluctant to count intangible assets as an asset. What's been happening, as you might know, and as Diane Coyle and the other excellent people who you've had on the podcast would have told you, is that national accounts have started to move a little bit to counting these various investments. So, for example, the software that's written should be counted as an investment. And what increasingly happens now is that the questionnaires that the statistical agencies send out to firms ask them not only about their investment in buildings and their investment in vehicles and their investment in equipment, but it asks them about their investment in software, how much they're writing themselves, how much they're buying in.
Of course, that's an input measure, right? That's not an output.
It is an input measure, but at least one would get some sense of what the investment in software is. Actually, for a while now, national accountants throughout the developed world, at least, have been asking about investment in artistic originals. So how much time are publishers spending writing new books and on all that kind of thing. So you capture a bit of that. What the national accountants don't count, because this is much more difficult, is the time spent on branding, the time spent on market research, and those types of spending. So where I think we've got to is a situation in which, at least in national accounts, we count some of the key intangible investments. We count R&D, we count software, we count artistic originals, but we don't count things like design, things like marketing, branding, those kind of issues. So we miss quite a lot of all of that. And then, and forgive me, Greg, because this is a very long answer to your question, how do we know? Stian and I wrote the books on the back of sort of 10, 12 years of work that we had done, which was essentially trying to be detectives, national accountants, detectives somehow or other, but which is to try to find alternative data sources on training, on design, on market research and market development. Get those resources, convert those into numbers which would reflect the spending that firms are making on those long-lived assets, re-engineer the national accounts and see what we came out with. And our claim then, which I started with, namely the economy has become much more intangible intensive, is the outcome of that sort of detective work. And what it shows, as I think people would not be surprised, just this increasing trend towards those more intangible assets, and less and less of which are being picked up in national accounts. So a sort of a bigger spread between what we think is the actual GDP and the measured GDP.
Right. And so there's going to be this huge gap between the market value of equity and the book value of equity, right? For most firms. I have this exercise that I do in my class where, I ask people, what is the Coke brand worth?
Right.
And most students, what they'll do is they'll just focus on that difference between the market value and the book value and say, that's what it's worth. Of course, that then becomes circular, right? Because if you're trying to do a valuation exercise to find out whether or not it's priced correctly, you need some kind of fundamental way of evaluating it. And I think, you mentioned at the beginning of one of the books, I forget which, the accountants swept into Stansted Airport and they had to put a value on it, right? And I think one of the reasons why I think this is difficult is because it seems like intangible investments have much more synergy, one of the four S's, right? It's difficult to, if Coke just auctioned off the Coke brand, it would presumably have a lot less value to some third party, right? Because it needs the entire infrastructure of Coca-Cola, the company, right? And all of the intellectual capital and all of the, tacit skill that those folks have when it comes to manufacturing and branding and marketing this stuff, right? So how are accountants tackling this? I mean, I think you cited Baruch Lev, who wrote this book on the end of accounting.
Yep.
I mean, how are kind of corporate and financial accountants dealing with this? How are lenders dealing with this? Because you talk about, collateral and how it serves such a central role in the financial system.
Yeah, we start with the example of Stansted Airport. If I could just scroll back to that for a second. So for people who haven't been to the UK, Stansted Airport is a sort of low-cost airline airport with there are very few international flights from the US. They're mostly European flights. But what it's got going for it is it's not as crowded as Heathrow Airport. And, they whip you in and out very quickly and turn the planes around very quickly. That's a sort of an asset. But if you think about valuing an airport as an asset, it's quite a nice example of where I think the accountants could all pretty much agree, because the assets which an airport have are basically tangible assets. They're the runway, right, or the roadway, as it were, and they're the buildings, and then they've got a load of equipment in there as well. And I don't think accountants would much disagree with the valuation of all those kinds of things, and that's what we let accountants do. We have a complicated system in the UK of regulation around airports, which essentially involves doing exactly what I just described, Greg, namely counting the value of the assets and then fixing a price to allow them a rate of return. So that's the sort of starting point. Now, increasingly, of course, what are airports doing is they're using clever software to get our bags from A to B, and this is actually very important from an airport point of view, monitor the air traffic and all that kind of thing. So how would we count the software? Well, again, the software is quite specialized for airports. And so we might do a sum of costs approach, for example. How much is the airport spending on the software? Or if it's buying it in from a specialist vendor and it's spent $100 million, you get sort of count that sort of number. So again, that sort of starts to build it up a little bit, but that gives you a sort of cost kind of approach in that relatively simple example. In a more complicated example, I don't know, maybe Microsoft itself might be quite a good example, where you'd imagine the market value, to go back to the question you set your students, like the market value of Coke, the market value of Microsoft will be some astonishing number in the billions and billions, possibly even in the trillions now. The tangible assets that Microsoft have got, well, they don't have any runways. Maybe they've got some buildings. They've got some buildings, I would have thought, right? Yeah. They must have a head office somewhere or other. They probably rent most of the other buildings. Their plant,
of course, those buildings would have very little value if Microsoft disappeared.
Yeah, that's true. Think of their plant and equipment, and again, contrast with the airport. They've probably got some pretty good computers in there, but again, they don't have gigantic amounts of what in Britain we call kit, specialized plant and equipment to sort the bags and schlep the bags from A to B by complicated conveyor belts and all that. So they haven't got any of that tangible stuff. So most of what's left over is on the intangible side. So I think, again, Greg, going back to the question you set your students, there are sort of two ways of going about it. One is to sort of infer the intangible value by the gap between the book value and the equity value. The second way is, again, more on the cost side. How much are they spending on the software? How much are they spending on the branding and all of that? In national accounts, we tend to go down the cost route. Actually, it's very conservative, of course, because you might have a very successful product, you might have a very unsuccessful product, but on average, it probably does. It's quite a good answer. The trouble with the equity gap route is equity markets go up and down. So getting a sort of a valuation with some durability to it, I think is quite hard on the equity side. Where the cost side, and I'll say one more thing if I may, Greg, where the costs approach falls down is this. Although it's conservative, which, in some respects can be a good idea, as you say, Greg, often these costs, the software assets and so forth, have got tremendous synergies. So turns out that Stansted Airport, like many of these low-cost airports, is pretty good at what it does. It's got really classy at dealing with the airlines, doing things quickly, disaffected passengers finding their bags and all of that. And the synergies is the word you mentioned, which we talk about a little bit in the book, are one of the features of intangible assets, that if you put these synergies together, the good software system with the good human resources and the good training, you get something which is more than the sum of the parts. And at that point, the costs approach becomes a conservative approach, but less good. So again, it's a bit of a toss-up in terms of the advantages of the different approaches.
Right. So the gap between the going concern value and the breakup value is also going to be a whole lot bigger when the company is using primarily intangibles.
It is. Again, it depends a bit on the company. Again, going back to the, so let's do airlines, actually. So airlines are massive users of software. Think about the booking that, you would have done on the airline. That goes through software. My understanding is that a lot of those software, that software is traded actually between the different airlines. So it is true that if airline X goes bankrupt, it loses a lot of its specific assets. Maybe it's got a good reputation, that kind of thing. It could certainly sell off all the planes, so it could sell off its tangible assets. To some extent, the intangible assets like software may be something that it can realize some sort of sale on. Certainly less than the tangible assets. So there may be some effects. It depends a bit on the different companies.
Well, it seems like there's another problem, which has to do with spillovers, where we only measure the value that's captured when we look at the value of a company, right? Or even when we're looking at inputs and investments, companies aren't going to invest unless they're able to capture the value. And it seems like the gap between the value created and the value captured is also going to be bigger when you are dealing with intangibles, because it's just simply more difficult to charge people for all of the value that's being created. You mentioned Harry Potter. I don't think that the author Harry Potter, the publisher of Harry Potter, was able to kind of claw back all of those benefits, right, that flowed from the creation of this IP.
So this is a tricky one, but this is an area where, back to your original question, now that we're in this intangible world, we've got to confront all of these issues. So I think there are, broadly speaking, Greg, three effects going on. The first is something like Harry Potter may well be protected by a lot of intellectual property protection. And it might be that although that was designed for a slightly earlier age, that would allow the owner of the asset to get some benefits from it. So certainly J.K. Rowling, who lives in the UK, as you know.
She's a billionaire, right?
She's a billionaire. She's done very well. Good luck to her. She's done very well out of it. So she's managed to make some return to it. The returns to the publishers and so forth, I'm sure they spend a lot of time trying to defend their intellectual property. So there's a set of questions around the intellectual property and the wrapping around all of that. I'll say one other thing, if I may, which goes back to the discussion we were just saying. On the one hand, with Harry Potter, you've got these various spillovers. People could potentially copy it. And as I say, the publishers spend a lot of time going after people who copy it and make unauthorized films and all that kind of thing. On the other hand, you've got the synergies that we were talking about earlier on. what's the sort of strength of the Harry Potter brand is the combination of the intangible assets around the script itself, which is an intangible asset, the software which does the special effects, as we were talking about earlier on, another intangible asset, the branding, the theatrical design, and all of those kind of things. And the reason I mention that, Greg, is when we first got into this, we were thinking that spillovers would be the predominant economic force, and therefore a more intangible economy would be in some broad sense a more equalized economy, because I come up with an intangible invention, you can use it. Whereas if I'm using my plane, a tangible asset, you cannot use it. So our first thought when we were writing the first book is surely this is a force for making the economy more equal. But that, of course, goes against people's intuition. We think the economy in some sense has become more unequal. And we changed our mind during the writing of the book, actually, and ended up thinking that the forces of synergies are a force, of course, for making it more unequal.
Well, because also scalability, right? Because you also
mentioned true.
Scalability is ultimately, leading to a winner-take-all situation, which is going to concentrate, right, the benefits.
No, indeed, that's quite right. But of course, if your idea can spill over to somebody else, they can try and scale up as well. So you might imagine big battles going on. But you're right. There's the force of scalability. So the scalability and the spillovers. The spillovers are a force for equality. The synergies and the scalability are a force much more for winner take all. And it looks like the current manifestation of the intangible economy, or as it were, stage one of the intangible economy, because we wrote our stuff before AI came along. In the pre-AI world, it looks like those forces for inequality seem to be winning out.
Well, I want to talk about intellectual property, because it's not just that the law of intellectual property is different from the law surrounding physical property, but also, it seems like the intellectual property laws were designed for a different type of intangible, right? And so when we're trying to think about the optimal amount of protection for intellectual property, a lot depends on the extent to which the intellectual property is going to be used as an input, right, to other intellectual property creation. And so you could have, I think for economists, we think, you can never have too much IP, but you can clearly have too much IP, right? And it grinds everything to a halt. So, when we think about patents and copyrights now seem to last forever. What is it, like 100? It's 100 years.
Right.
Disney, I think Mickey Mouse just finally entered the public domain.
I think it did, but Snow White is still protected, I believe. But anyway.
Mickey himself, I think Mickey himself he was the first creation, I think. So
right.
Steamboat Willie, I think he's okay.
Yes.
But yeah, you're right. All the subsequent inventions, we got to wait a couple decades. But are intellectual property laws, insufficient for this new economy?
I think so, for many of the reasons which we've touched on a little bit. I think a lot of the intellectual property laws are designed. I think of the pharmaceutical industry as an example. Now, your pharmaceutical listeners and viewers will murder me for saying all of this, but let me try a gross simplification of the pharmaceutical industry. Many of my friends who work in pharmaceuticals say that one helpful way of thinking about pharmaceuticals is it's a single chemical formula which can be protected by a single patent. Now, it's true that people can then see the patent and invent other things and so forth, but that's a relatively straightforward thing to get your arms around. It's quite well specified. Our intellectual property rules quite rightly want to reward people so that their efforts are not copied, so that they can't make a reasonable return and all that kind of thing. I'm in favor of all of that. I think the modern day intangible world is quite different in the type of intellectual the sort of spread of intellectual assets which underlie quite a lot of modern inventions. So the smartphone is something that we talk about. That is, I think, 120 odd patents, some very large number of patents. the idea that you could actually protect all 120 of them, or you could protect 119 of them, and then the whole thing would be held up by the owner of the 120th, that's not going to make any sense. We're not going to get very far with that. And so that's sort of an example of the synergies. When you have to put all this stuff together, it's not clear that very restrictive intellectual property rules are going to get you there. So drawing that margin, I admit, is very, very hard to do. But in the end, in the book, we come down rather against a further extension of intellectual property rules. We would rather keep intellectual property rules tight as they are, but confined to the industries where they are at the moment. So like the industries like the pharmaceutical industry, rather than extending them out further, which is what some lobbyists want to happen.
Well, it seems like, I mean, there's length, but there's also breadth, right? So, the difference when the breadth is too big, then you can't find substitutes, right? If it's sufficiently narrow, then you can say, all right, I'll go find, I mean, if you think about a tangible, if Saudi oil is not available, well, you can, sub in some Alaskan oil. You might have to make some tweak to the refinery, but you can pretty much do it. If the patents are too broad, then, this holdup process becomes serious.
No, absolutely. So again, the design of the intellectual property rules is very difficult. And I think, so I haven't looked at this for a while, Europe and America has gone in different directions as far as software is concerned. We, in Europe, you're not allowed, it's very, very difficult to patent software. And again, I think people are worried about the breadth type of issues there as well.
Right. Well, if measurement is so difficult, because one of the big challenges that you point to is this stagnation, right? And I've interviewed some other folks like Robert Gordon on the podcast who
he's excellent.
Emphasize this sort of stagnation, right, where the productivity increases have not been as good as they were for our parents and grandparents. But then you've got folks like Eric Brynjolfsson who say, well, this is in large part a measurement problem. We're not really measuring output correctly, or, right. And of course he's saying that because he's also thinking about intangibles, or that most of the stuff that we might normally think of as output is actually input. And so therefore it's just kind of kicking the can down the road. And maybe a different way to measure productivity would be to focus on not the flows, but the stocks, right? So while incomes seem to be stagnating, it's clear that asset values are going up a lot. And if we use that metric for productivity, then maybe, we're not experiencing stagnation. So how should we be thinking about this stagnation issue?
Ooh, I'm a little nervous about thinking about asset values as a measure of productivity. We've just come out of it, but we had for 30 years an era of very, very low real interest rates. I used to work at the Bank of England, so that was our job. And very low.
Thank you for the cheap mortgages, by the way. Just saying.
I'll mention that to the governor. I'll tell him you're very grateful.
Send a thank you note for all of us who actually managed to borrow a lot of money during that period. I just want to send a thank you note.
All thank you notes gratefully received. I got very little fan mail whilst I was working at the Bank of England, I have to tell you. But anyway, so when you have an era of low interest rates, such as used to be the case, then you have an era of high asset prices. So whether asset prices are a guide to productivity, I'm rather more doubtful. I think it's a combination. It's a sort of perfect storm, a lot of these things. I think what's happened is the economy, and here I'm with Eric Brynjolfsson, but also Bob Gordon, who says a little bit of this, the economy is getting harder and harder to measure. A more and more service-orientated economy, a more and more intangible-orientated economy, a more digital economy as well, free Gmail, free Google Maps. All of that is getting much more difficult to measure. So I think part of the slowdown is due to that. I think a second element of the slowdown is due to the little discussion we were having earlier on. I mean, as I say, when we first wrote the book, you'd think, here's an economy investing loads and loads and loads of intangible assets. There've got to be all these spillovers so that my investment, Greg, is going to help you. That boosts the whole economy. That raises all the boats.
It was the Paul Romer story, right? So,
exactly.
Right? So why wouldn't the Paul Romer story, which worked for things like steam engines, work for things like, say, generative AI?
Well, we'll come to AI in a minute, but in the pre-AI era, as I say, I think it's this battle between spillovers and the synergies, and as you rightly mentioned, the scale. The spillovers is the force for equalization, raising all the boats. The synergies in the scale is a force for individual companies doing well, but less, boats being raised elsewhere. So my personal explanation for this is, and again, I changed my mind on all of this. So it's been an interesting experience for me, if for nobody else. My personal explanation for this is that the pace of the intangible economy has carried on, but those spillover benefits have got a bit less, and that is at least part of the explanation for why the economy has rather stagnated. If you equate that with Eric Brynjolfsson's story about how things are harder to measure, you get seemingly quite a big slowdown. But that then takes us, we wrote both of these books before ChatGPT and AI, so it takes us to what the effect of AI might be in the future, which I think is also kind of interesting. But I'll stop there rather than gassing on about AI. We can do that, or we can come to that later.
Well, maybe we can dive into it because, right, Eric's point is that this is a GPT. Now, maybe are GPTs different, right?
Yes.
Do they, so they do have, I mean, their defining feature is the spillover. I mean, last night I composed like 8 songs on an app, right? Original songs, and it took me like 10 minutes.
Right.
This is incredible. Now, of course, a lot of people would say this would not be possible if they didn't just scrape every single song on Spotify. And oh my gosh, they're stealing all of this insight from all of these artists. Isn't that awful? And if they did figure out a way to put a stop to that, then this whole thing would grind to a halt. But I mean, so is it the Paul Romer story primarily about GPTs? And then once we start, building the apps on top of this, then we'll be back into the more conventional story that you described.
It's the GPT story is half right, but it's only half right. So let me try something which I think people have skated over a little bit, with great respect to Paul Romer and to Eric Brynjolfsson. I think they skated over a little bit another dimension of this, which is this. So people will be familiar with a GPT, a general purpose technology. That's a type of technology which can spread everywhere. So since I'm in Britain, I of course have to mention Steam. So Steam was the sort of intangible AI invention of its time, absolutely revolutionized. We used to have horsepower, by which I mean horses were doing the power. Then we invented steam, completely revolutionized railways, transatlantic shipping, all that kind of thing. So steam was a general purpose technology because it could be used in lots of different things. Here's the difference with AI. It can be used in lots of different things, but AI is also an invention in the method of invention. That's what's clever about it, I think, and takes it into a different dimension. What do I mean by that? If you ask a scientist here at Imperial, at MIT, or on the West Coast, if you ask a scientist how they're using AI, they will tell you, I think, it is marvelously, monumentally helpful in the invention process which they are going through. Ask the nuclear fusion scientists, Greg, forgive me, maybe you've had them on your podcast, about how we're going to get to nuclear fusion. And the answer is the modeling of the magnetic field which you need to get nuclear fusion going was impossible before AI. No human brain could do it, and indeed even powerful computers couldn't do it. That, my scientist friends tell me, has been revolutionized by the progress of AI. Ask the robotic surgeons who develop the surgery arms and the machines and this, that, and the other, which help do keyhole surgery. Keyhole surgery has kind of revolutionized the extent to which we recover from surgery. And you mentioned football earlier on. Football players can, have complicated surgery on knees and this, that, and the other. The AI is now being used to even further mechanize that and have even better insights and more accuracy and less trauma as a consequence of all of that. So the reason I sort of say all this is not only is AI a general purpose technology, think steam, but it's got this additional element to it for powering innovation. So why is all that important? If the economy is moving to a more intangible economy, the way to think about that is to think about the people who are producing these intangibles. So these are the people who are writing the software, who are doing the R&D, who are doing the design, who are devising the new marketing campaigns and so forth, and ask, how's AI, is AI going to help them out? And you bet it's going to help them out. Right. Again, the R&D, the software, the design, and all of that is going to be incredibly helpful. So this is all a very long way of saying, when you have a general purpose technology, which is also an invention, method of invention, you get two boosts to productivity. The first boost to productivity is in the invention sector itself, what I would call the intangible sector itself, as I say, the R&D and the software and all that. You get a boost to productivity there. And then the second boost to productivity is when all of those new inventions, now think of steam, start spreading out to the economy as a whole to be used in the transport sector, in companies, in firms, and all that kind of thing. So I've changed my mind about this, actually, to be honest. I've become very bullish about AI and its effect on productivity. And that's why I think the earlier arguments, you mentioned Bob Gordon and Eric Brynjolfsson and all that kind of thing, the earlier arguments, I think, need a bit of a refresh in the era of AI, for which, as I say, I'm actually rather optimistic.
Now, when I teach my strategy class, I also make a distinction between tangibles and intangibles. But within intangibles, I make a distinction between the era where intellectual property, right, trademarks and copyrights and patents were the source of value, to the current era where I think data plays a much more significant role. And, there I make the point that most of these algorithms are public. In fact, if you're Facebook and you're Google, oftentimes you will open source, right, the algorithms, but you'll guard the data jealously, right? And you'll put all sorts of barriers and protections to make sure that people can't get access to your data. Does that kind of shift things a little bit? And I guess it means that what people are investing in, it's not just that they're investing in the collection of data, but they're also investing in moats that would kind of protect others from getting access to that data. Should we be thinking about those investments as rent-seeking, right, and therefore potentially wasteful?
That's an interesting thought, and you're quite right, Greg. Coming along with AI in this sort of new wave of intangibles is that we've got to expand our list of intangible assets. I mentioned software, but what I should have said is software and data, and indeed separate data out. So, I think that's the first point about it, that the list of intangible assets is getting bigger and bigger, and the data asset is one. Again, I have mixed feelings about this, about how this is going to play out. Let me try a similar example to try to bring this to life for people. Here at Imperial, we do a lot of work with Rolls-Royce. Now, Rolls-Royce have got incredible amounts of data because they're enormous, as everybody will know in the aero engine business. Rolls-Royce have got incredible amounts of data coming in literally every second of the day from the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of planes which are up in the sky, sending back data on whether the engine's getting hot or cold and how it's performing and all that kind of thing. That data, as you say, Greg, is very jealously guarded by Rolls-Royce because that's going to help them, along with AI, to make the next generation of aero engines to fly us even further and hopefully economize on jet fuel and contribute to the climate and all that kind of stuff. The software they use is a fair amount of open source software. So just as you say, Greg, in some sense, lots of people have got those algorithms and lots of people have got ready access to the software. They can just download it from GitHub or whatever it might be. But it's the data that then becomes the crucial asset. So again, maybe this is another force, against the equalization that we were talking about earlier on. Maybe what that means is the companies who've got already enormous data sets are going to be the companies who are going to succeed in the AI-powered intangible economy. As well. So that's one thought. The other thought is that these data assets aren't as powerful, aren't as big a moats as you would think. My kids tell me that there's an app called Tinder that you can get on the phone. My understanding is that Tinder started from almost nothing. They had no data on the various individuals and moved to some enormous number of people logging on and using it. So there's an interesting case, Greg, where actually you didn't need any data at all. You needed a clever app and lots of willing individuals. And so data was actually not the moat that you needed. That was much more of a sort of software play. So I have mixed feelings actually about how this is going to play out.
Well, I want to say a few things about finance, because you talk about the limitations of debt finance. And, I always think of continental Europe and, Japan as economies that are fundamentally debt-based. I think of the U.S. economy as primarily equity-based. And it seems to have been an advantage, right? So when we look at most of the big companies in the world, they're venture-backed companies, right? They didn't go to Deutsche Bank and get a loan, right, to get off the ground. And so, I mean, is the institution of finance, right, in more large parts of the world, maladaptive, right, for a world that is primarily based on intangibles? And even within the U.S., you talk about the preference that we give to debt. And as someone who taught corporate finance for years, I've always puzzled as to why we treat debt differently from equity.
Yeah, this is a bad institutional feature. You mentioned this right at the very beginning. This is a little bit more we'd write about in the second book. This is an institutional feature which is just not fit for the way the economy has evolved. And it's exactly because if I go to a bank with a tangible asset, with an aircraft, with a piece of equipment, with a vehicle, sure, I can get a loan against the security of that tangible asset. If I go to a bank with an idea for a movie script, or a terrific new idea for doing some marketing, then I'm not going to get a loan, or it's going to be much harder to get a loan as well. And the venture capital industry fulfills precisely that gap. So I think that's the right way to think about it. And unfortunately, the banking system, well, certainly in the UK, is very well adapted to lending to people to buy a house. Especially in an era where we've had, massive house price growth over the last 30 years. The banking system, 70% of the lending is essentially to people to buy a house. It's much less suited to these intangible assets. Where that takes one is to ask the question, well, why don't we have a venture capital industry in Europe like they've got in America? They seem to know what they're doing over there in Silicon Valley. Why can't we do the same? And European governments have thrown money at the problem and had commissions of inquiry and appointed, clever people and all of that. And somehow the puzzle is we haven't managed to have a Silicon Valley. So to a certain extent, we've had bits of it. So London has got some financing. There's this very successful startup financing in South Korea, maybe in Israel as well. But it's proved a very difficult model to repeat, and that suggests that there's something much more going on around Silicon Valley than just the provision of money. It is the collection of expertise, maybe the synergies that we were talking about earlier on, the collection of expertise and the experience that people have built up, which along with the money is a sort of fertile ground for financing all of those startups. But yeah, indeed, the bias towards debt, we've got to do something about that. Otherwise, Europe is going to carry on lagging behind in intangible investment.
Yeah, but I mean, the Kosian story would be that as the technology changes, the way in which the property rights are structured would change to facilitate market transactions, right? That we wouldn't need to have all of this informal interactions, right? So, I mean, you're right. I mean, Silicon Valley, so much is built on these informal networks and unstructured communications and non-market transactions. But one would predict that all of that would ultimately be sort of formalized and systematized and made, transferable so that anywhere in the world you could adopt the playbook. But that hasn't happened.
I think it's a little bit like, teleworking and video conferencing and so forth. There's something about human contact which possibly us economists don't quite understand because we're not psychologists, as opposed to we're not humans. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was wondering where you were going with that.
Some of my best friends are economists. Yeah, that maybe there's just something about the types of knowledge and the types of interactions which actually can't be codified, which are at the heart of this. I mean, the other angle on this, Greg, which I think is interesting, is my understanding of the data is that even Silicon Valley have been amazingly successful at funding, broadly speaking, ICT and software, but much less successful at funding, for example, green technology and some of those technologies, we're going to need to make progress on climate change, which again tells you, I think, that even, as I say, in very successful ecosystems like Silicon Valley, they're quite delicate in terms of what skills both they can bring to the firms, but also can be transferred elsewhere.
Now, you also talk about competition, right? And so, I had Thomas Philippon on the show, and of course, his argument is that we have moved to a world with much less competition. And it would seem like if you're going to be rattling off all of the problems of the modern intangible economy, it would seem logical that, well, yeah, of course, we've got Google, and we've got Amazon, and we've got Apple, and we've got Nvidia, we've got all these massive big companies that seem to be monopolies. And that would seem to suggest that we are living in a world with less competition. I mean, I think you're offering a little more subtle story here. What is it with competition, but also competition law and competition policy?
Yeah. I don't know if we're being more subtle. It's very kind of you to say. Let me try to live up to that. We think that a lot of people have gone wrong by just looking at size. Sure, as you mentioned in your question, Google is large and Amazon is large and all that kind of thing. But that goes back, Greg, you mentioned it earlier on in your question, to scale. In a lot of these, especially intangible companies, the ability to scale up is enormous. So size, I think, becomes much less of a signal about whether you think there are competition problems than people think. Now, to be sure, the competition authorities are not stupid and they don't just look at size, but I think quite a lot of the commentary says, oh, look at these big companies, there must be a problem with competition, end of, sort of thing. So I think that's the first point. The second point to back that is you would think if there has been a real problem with competition, some measure of the rates of return must go up enormously in the economy. And this is where we circle back to the measurement. If you measure Microsoft's rate of return by its profitability divided by its capital as measured, as we were discussing earlier on, it's got hardly any capital, right? A couple of buildings and a few computers, but hardly anything else. Contrast that with the airport. If you measure it by its profitability relative to its both tangible and intangible capital, you get a very different picture. And it doesn't look like these companies are profitable. It doesn't look like they're vastly abnormally profitable. So I think the illusion of size and the illusion of not counting the capital can lead you to quite in the wrong direction. I think that's led many people to mistakenly think that there's been some massive reduction in the amount of competition. And we think that's just not the case. So what's the implication of that to the competition authorities? Can they just go home and forget about it? No, they can't. They've got to be much more alert, I think, to the possibilities of competition around rivalry, rather than a sort of an ex-post view about this company is big and there are not any other big companies. What is the scope for rivalry in the industry? Look, with the entry of ChatGPT, we've seen a bit of rivalry against Google. Who would have thought it? But the search engines around ChatGPT look like, if anything, they look like they're better than Google. Nobody would have predicted that. So that's where the competition authorities, I think, should be concentrating.
Right, and of course, it makes no sense to look at things like markups, right? Because or marginal cost is typically zero for most of these things.
Exactly.
So
right.
that whole way of thinking has to be replaced in some way.
No, exactly right. And again, for people who haven't been following this, we talk about this a little bit in the second book. A lot of the economics literature is based on, to be fair to the very smart econometricians, some very sophisticated statistics which attempt to estimate these markups. But as you say, Greg, if you're in a world where you've basically got all intangible capital, and you're not measuring that intangible capital, you're just measuring the small amount of tangible capital, you're bound to get some peculiar measure of markups, whereas what's really going on is the marginal cost is almost zero.
Now, I was wondering if we could talk about infrastructure, right? Because in a tangible economy, right, you want to build bridges, you want to build canals, you want to build all of these things, railroads, whatever. Some of it private, of course, but a lot of it is going to be public. These are public goods. And if you can't collect tolls or whatever, then you need to do it with tax revenue. And even like this latest bill, the Biden bill, the big infrastructure bill, it tended to focus on tangible infrastructure. So when we're talking about intangible infrastructure, what do we mean by that? And what would it be the role of the government in building this out? I mean, obviously, we know about DARPA and its role in the creation of the internet. I mean, is that sort of the I don't know, canonical case? Should we be thinking about more ARPANET type of creations that are only made possible by government investment?
I think that's right. I think the way to think about it is that there's the tangible infrastructure you mentioned, and the intangible infrastructure is things like e-infrastructure. So that would be broadband as an example. I can't speak for the US, but a lot of the broadband build out in Europe has basically been government sponsored. And so that's subject to all the difficulties that are there. The other issue around, I don't know whether it's infrastructure or spending, but let's call it the sort of, again, the ecosystem around the private intangible economy is public spending on intangibles, and most notably the science budget. Now, the science budget is, of course, it's a sort of Keynesian dream case, right? By which I mean this. Often the anti-Keynesians will say, listen, if the private sector builds something, that just preempts resources from the public sector. It takes away builders and it takes away equipment and all of that. So all that happens is it crowds out public sector investment. There's quite a lot of evidence that's the case. Whereas quite a lot of evidence suggests that investment in public R&D does exactly the opposite. In other words, it crowds in private sector R&D for some of the reasons that we touched on, Greg, when we were talking about AI, that to the extent that the public sector is going to give you, public sector R&D is going to give you public sector software, open source software, various public sector ways of doing things, maybe public sector labs, things like that. They seem to have a crowding in effect. So I think that's increasingly important as well. Interestingly, in the UK, the science budget, by which I mean the public science budget, has been pretty much depoliticized, actually. All political parties agree that it's a sort of a good thing, and it's somewhat on autopilot, which I think has helped UK science very much. So I'm pleased that actually that's an area of at least the public intangible economy, where the institutions have changed and changed for the better.
Now, I think this is a work in part of institutional economics, and you point to how Doug North, I guess, and that literature inspired you to think about the world as having a mismatch, right, between institutions. And I like this metaphor of the yeast, right? The 15%, right? I guess that's the number when your wine starts to turn into port, right?
Right.
Right. And so, once the threshold has been crossed and we now have moved into a world that is dominated by intangibles, there's a mismatch with our institutions. And, we've talked about the accounting, we've talked about the legal, and we've talked about, what are some of the steps that you think need to be taken? And are these steps that need to be taken primarily by central governments, or are they steps that can be taken by the legal system and by the educational system?
So in the context of what we've just been talking about, there are some obvious steps around banking and all of that. It may just need government nudges to push that ahead. It may be some autonomous effects for the private sector can push that ahead. One area where the government stands, I think, in the way, which we haven't talked about, and I think comes under the heading of institutions, is the planning and the zoning system. Now, I know Ezra Klein and who is his co-author? Is it David Thompson? I can't. I think I'm very embarrassed. I can't remember the name. Their new book on abundance talks a lot about planning. If you want to see restrictive style planning, come to the UK. And the trouble with having a very restrictive planning system is you might think, well, that's going to be very difficult to build roads and do all the various tangible infrastructure. The trouble with a restrictive planning system in an intangible economy is that it prevents the formation of clusters. The fact is if we want to get...
You mean like zoning and approvals and licensing, right?
Correct. The synergies around Harry Potter were realized in London, because in London you have a whole cluster of people who visited London will know the theatres, you have a cluster of software writers, the British movie industry has a whole section of London where you have a lot of software writers and editors and artistic people and all those kinds of things. If you have a planning and zoning system which prevents people moving to London to take advantage of that, which prevents the building of new buildings and new offices where all this can take place, that is going to be extraordinarily costly in an intangible economy. Of course, it preserves the look of places and all that kind of thing. So of course, there are benefits to all of that. But I think what we claim in the book, which I think is right, is set against those benefits, the costs are just going to become more and more and more as the economy gets more and more intangible. So that, I think, feels to me, Greg, like an institutional fix, which only governments can do, because the planning and the zoning and the permit system is sort of, at least in the UK, is very centralized and it's government directed.
Right. And you talk about at the end of the book, the role of influencing activities, right? So if the government is creating more public goods, then you're basically setting in motion a contest, right, among different interested parties. How do you ensure that most of the gains, the potential gains from these investments, are not dissipated by influencing activities, rent seeking, and the like?
Yeah, and I'm not sure we've got some brilliant solutions here, because this is very difficult. What we need, and again, I think it's talked about a little bit in the abundance book, is a bit of state capacity, where the state has got sufficient skill and sort of nous to be able to resist essentially a lot of rent seeking that's going on, and make decisions which would hopefully benefit everybody, as opposed to the particular parties, the narrow groups of parties who are particularly affected by all of this. That's going to need a brave state to sort of do all of that. We have some, again, it's back to the institutions. We have some institutions which I think are very helpful. In my opinion, an independent central bank is extremely helpful in setting monetary policy, such that there isn't rent seeking and so forth going on. That's really important as well. But these more fiscal decisions around zoning and planning and building and all those kind of things, those types of decisions are much harder. The science, as I mentioned before, Greg, has been somewhat depoliticized, so we seem to have got to a good institutional place there. I think we need some more examples of that.
Now, last question. When you're talking about all of the ills that are attributable to this mismatch, you mentioned the bullshit jobs, right?
Right.
David Graeber, right? And so, of course, anybody who is sitting in a bullshit job would be eager to hear a potential remedy for this. But I mean, how does even that ailment of our society get attributed to this mismatch?
Well, I think people are too cruel about bullshit jobs. I mean, I think what that group who use that phrase, they sort of can't understand what people are doing if they're not actually making a physical thing or, I don't know, out performing on a stage or something like that. They can't work out why they're shuffling paper from A to B and so forth.
Yeah. Well,
Look,
people have
maybe
said that all the time about, finance people. They say, oh, they're
exactly.
parasites, right? And, all they're doing is just moving money around, right?
So there's a bit of that, and the extent to which states do and do not bail out the financial system, of course, is very contentious. But we just make the point that one way of understanding quite a few of these jobs is that they're coordination jobs. People who are agents for software writers, for movie stars, and this, that, and the other. They're not writing the software, or they're not being movie stars somehow or other. But what they're doing is they're coordinating, and they're realizing the synergies that you get in an intangible economy. So I think we're pleading for a little bit more sympathy for those kinds of jobs, as I say, manifestations of the changed economy that we've got.
Hmm. And of course, as the mechanisms for the mobility of intangible assets and monetizability of intangible assets grows and develops, in some sense, that could lead to just ever more of these jobs. But one would hope that those jobs would be less bullshit-like, right? That you could actually do a lot more in one of those jobs with a lot less tedium.
That's true, and AI is coming to help with all of that. The other way I'd put it, Greg, if I may, is lots of people have asked us for careers advice on the basis of this. How can my children avoid the bullshit jobs? Or younger people have come to us and said, well, all this intangible stuff, does this mean? And what they often think we mean is that the only career is going to be an amazing computer programmer, or a high-tech marketer, or an algorithm writer. So what they've got to do is abandon all humanities and arts and go and just do sciences and high-tech maths and matrices and God knows what else. And we say, actually, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. Once you start, sure, there are those jobs, but once you start thinking about the task of coordinating the synergies and getting all these people together, that needs, guess what? That needs people. And scientists might be really good at that, but artists and poets and historians and students of ancient Greek, they might be really good at that as well. So were you asking me, Greg, about the future? I'm optimistic, actually, that the future could admit people with all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of skills into this new world.
Well, I think one other unintended consequence of AI will be a surge in what we might think of as craft jobs, right? Instead of paying $1 for your cheese, you'll spend $5 for your cheese because it'll be made by some, retired lawyer who's moved to the Cotswolds and is, doing everything by hand and, creating a nice backstory about the cheese and, the names of the goats and so forth, right?
Right. Some authenticity around it.
And that's an intangible, right? That's when you buy a wine because it's got this wonderful backstory. That is an intangible that represents the difference between that price and the price you'd pay for, a more boring version of the same wine.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me. These books are fantastic, and I think that they should be read together. Capitalism Without Capital and Restarting the Future. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Greg. Absolute pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.